On this page of notes, I'm going to investigate graphing the tangent function, and we're going to develop the parent graphs for the tangent function and then also what the reflected tangent graph would look like. As you can see along the top here, I've already filled in this grid. What I did was I evaluated tangent for each of my key values, finding its values on the unit circle. Notice that some of them have x's. That's because when I evaluate tangent at those angles, I get undefined values. I've highlighted several key values here because those are the undefined parts are going to create my vertical asymptotes, and I just always like to identify where it crosses the x-axis. The values of -1 and +1 are going to help me create a vertical stretch of my graph as I move forward. Down here on my grids, on the right-hand side on the positive x-axis, I've divided that into 4 pieces, the same way I did for sine and cosine. And then because my angles go in the negative values, I gave a point to the left. So now I'm going to draw in my vertical asymptotes everywhere that my graph is undefined. Again, I'm particularly only going to label these highlighted values. So I have a -π/2. I have 0. My next point that I'm going to identify is +π/2. And I can draw in that vertical asymptote as well. The next one is going to be pi, and the next one is going to be 3π/2. And I can draw in that vertical asymptote as well. I'm not going to use this last point right here, but I could if I wanted to, if I wanted to continue my tangent graph. I'm going to go ahead and put the same information on my reflected graph. Since it's just going to be a reflection, I can copy this information over. Just copying it from the original graph here. Same thing on this one. I'm not going to use my last point, although I could if I wanted to graph more of my graph. Now, these values of -1 and 1, although my tangent graph is going to go to positive infinity and negative infinity, it's going to go in each direction here. These numbers I can use to put on my y-axis, and what I understand is that -π/4 is halfway between -π/2 and 0. So I can just kind of estimate here about halfway between, and I'm going to put a point at -1. Again, halfway between these two, I'm going to put a point at +1. Those points are kind of nice because it allows me to give a small shape of my tangent, and then I can take that shape and just continue it on down. Helps me create a little bit better curve. Can do the same thing here. Halfway between, I'm going to give myself a -1. Halfway between, I'm going to give myself a +1. If I draw in this middle part first, then I can extend on down. So that's going to represent my parent graph for tangent. And what you should notice is that this curve has repeated itself twice. What that means is that this is one period of tangent, and this is another period of tangent. When we were looking at sine and cosine, and we covered the entire unit circle, we only got to see this cycle for sine and cosine once. But for tangent, when we look at a 2π cycle, we actually get to see 2 periods of tangent. Now, the reflected graph is not going to change very much for us, other than my points are going to reflect up. So this -1 here, I'm going to reflect it to a positive, so still halfway between, and then I'm going to put my point right here, still halfway between, but this point needs to reflect down. So same as before, I can kind of draw in this little piece. It's actually easier to draw this small curve first and then extend up to the asymptotes. That creates a little better shape for us. Same thing, halfway I'm going to go up this time, halfway I'm going to go down this time. Same thing, reflecting this, extending up to the asymptotes. So that's the development of our tangent and our tangent parent graph and our reflected tangent parent graph. I can also indicate just one more time here to notice my period, and I can see that I have two of them. The other thing that I can calculate is to understand how long it takes to complete a tangent cycle, and from negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2 is just pi. So the period for tangent is going to be different than the period for our sine and cosine. We can write that here right now, that the period for tangent is simply pi. We can also indicate the fact that this repeats over and over again. So when we write our domain, it's not going to be negative infinity to positive infinity because we have these gaps. So writing our domain for this will be a little different. Our range, of course, is from negative infinity to positive infinity. And we could go ahead and write that one if we would like. We'll get into the writing the period on our examples on the next page.